Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this episode. I'm Amanda Morin.
And I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. This episode aligns with Chapter 3 of Amanda's and my book, Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools.
The book we wrote together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice to start with something light in the beginning of this conversation.
Dismantling ableism.
Because really when it comes down to it, ableism is a scary thing to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm just going to be honest and saying, like, when we talk about ableism, people get nervous because they're worried that they're not doing it the right way. They're not doing something, when we talk about isms, right? We're talking about exclusion. We're talking about how people feel discriminated against. We're talking about a lot of things that are heavy, right? And I think to lead into this conversation, it's important to understand that ableism isn't just something that happens outside of people with disability, right? And neurodivergence as part of the disability and all of that, that ableism is also something that comes from within sometimes too. I think it's that we should start this conversation by talking about the fact that we're not just talking to the educators. We're talking to the educators so they can recognize the fact that their students may also have some internalized ableism that they need to support as well.
And when we talk about internalized ableism, a lot of that is just about the experience of living in the world that we live in and the messages that we receive. So many characteristics of neurodivergence are basically interpreted as moral failings, right? You're disorganized, you're unmotivated, you don't care, you're apathetic. And it's so much more than that. And I think something that's kind of funny, I had this memory relatively recently within the past couple of years. So I was diagnosed as ADHD when I was in 5th grade and took medication. And again, for women, especially, in my age group, that was pretty rare. I mean, I don't think I knew anyone else who was a girl who was diagnosed as ADHD when I was a kid. I knew a lot of boys who were. But this was the early 90s, and this was kind of a newer diagnosis that people were still learning about. The rates of diagnosis were increasing rapidly. By the time I got to high school, and I was, I think maybe a sophomore, I had kind of told my parents, I'm like, well, I don't want to take my medication anymore. I kind of just want to do it on my own. And they were like, okay, try it, figure it out, whatever. My junior year of high school, I had to write a term paper in my English class. And the topic of my term paper was ADHD, the excuse of the 90s. I look back and I'm like, that's all so much of that internalized ableism, the messages I was receiving. I wish I could find it somewhere. I don't know, but I remember one of the sources that I used was this copy of, I think it was Newsweek magazine, and it had a picture of a pill on the front cover. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go back and see if I can find that some way. But
I remember that Newsweek. Yeah.
You do? Okay. So I'm not imagining that.
No.
If we can find it, we'll put a link in the show notes. And it was just all of these messages. And I think it's so interesting because even from that point on, I went the rest of my teens and 20s realistically treating myself for anxiety and depression because I just didn't think I was really ADHD. I didn't think that was an accurate diagnosis. And ultimately, when I became a parent and my oldest child was diagnosed, I went back to my doctor and I was like, I just want to look into this. What do you think? And it's amazing how much that has changed and also improved my life by recognizing that about myself. That internalized ableism really sticks with us.
And Emily, I've heard you tell that story before, right? And I don't mean that like, I've heard you tell that story before. I mean it like the first time I heard you tell that story, I was amazed. Because I've only known you to be this Emily, mm-hmm. right? Like this version of yourself who accepts that you're ADHD, that accepts that sort of impacts the way you interact with the world sometimes and how the world interacts with you. I was so surprised to know that you had felt that way at some point. And it makes me think a lot about how we look at disability as a society, mm-hmm. right? And so that excuse of the 90s is a really interesting thing to me. I think we can't have a conversation about ableism without having a conversation about the social model of disability. Mm-hmm. Because when we talk about disability, there are all these different ways to look at it. One of which is sort of that medicalized model where we say there is inherently something wrong with you that we need to fix. that is not the model that we use when we're talking about neurodiversity affirming schools, right? The social model of disability is the one that I really like people to understand, right? The social model of disability says that there are variations in how you interact with the world, whether it's because you're neurodivergent or because you have a mobility disability or have any other kind of disability or disabled in any other kind of way. But that the disability component of that comes into play when it interacts with your environment in a way that becomes disabling. So I'll give you an example, right? I have significant sensory processing issues, right? So I have a hard time with bright lights. I have a hard time with unexpected noises. I have a hard time with temperature, those kinds of things. It makes it hard for me to really function in my environment. When I am in airports, for example, I am barely functional. And I mean that sincerely. I am barely functional. I can only see what I'm focused right on. I can get to the gate. I can sit down. But it's because there's so much noise. There's so much bright lights. There's so much going on that I don't feel enabled to be my best self. I feel disabled. I feel significantly disabled. On the other hand, when I go somewhere where I can dim the lights, or I can ask somebody to dim the lights for me, when I can say, hang on just a minute, I really want to talk to you, but I need to finish this conversation first so I can make sure I'm giving you my full attention. I don't feel disabled at all. I don't feel like my differences in how I experience the world are getting in the way of my ability to function. So when we talk about social model of disability, we're really talking about the fact that society has barriers in place that make it difficult for people to be productive, to be functioning at their best level. And I think that when we talk about ableism, we really need to look at the social model of disability, because when we're talking about ableism, we are talking about the ways in which society looks at certain aspects of people or certain aspects of being as better or worse than others, and not just different. And we see it in our language sometimes. Back when Twitter was my social platform of choice, I have been well known to be, Emily's laughing at me. I have been known to call out a newspaper for using a headline like plane crippled in storm, right?
Mm.
Those are words that have very charged meanings. You can just say, and has engine failure during a storm. You're just saying exactly what happened in a neutral way, right? But there are ways in which we set up our spaces, we set up our language that inherently say something is better than something else, right? And we look at things and say, this is quote unquote normal, right? And if you fall outside that quote unquote normal, then you are the problem. And we're going to talk about you as less. We're going to make spaces that don't accommodate your needs. And that itself is kind of the basis of ableism.
It's always a hard conversation to have. It requires us to really explore some of our own implicit biases and rethink how we approach things. And so I know that this is going to be a really good conversation. You've got an interview with Tim that we'll listen to here in a moment. So everyone can just hang tight and stay with us. My first year's teaching included a lot of trial and error as I tried to figure out who I was as a teacher and how I could best support my students. As I tried to figure that out, and I would try certain things on and then go, this doesn't feel right to me. And I was amazed at how little had changed in how we supported students from the time that I was a student in school. As I had the opportunity to start working with a wider range of learners, and then also began working as a school counselor and a therapist with neurodivergent learners, I really started to recognize how so many of the beliefs and the systems baked into the culture of our schools do a disservice to our neurodivergent students. Amanda and I are committed to helping to create the change that we need in our schools to create neurodiversity-affirming environments and remove those barriers that stand in the way of success for our students. And so in order to help that progress along, we have actually created several online courses that you can bring to your school and use for professional development with your teachers. Whether you use them as a course that teachers progress through independently or implement them during your professional development time or a faculty meeting, these courses are created to help educators develop the skills they need to support neurodivergent learners. You can head on over to neurodiversity-affirming-schools.com or click the link in the show notes to learn more. Okay, up next is Amanda's conversation about combating ableism in our schools with Tim Villegas.
Tim Villegas is the Director of Communications for the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education. He's also the founder of Think Inclusive, which is the blog, the podcast, and the social media handle of the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education. Tim has 16 years of experience in public education as a teacher and a special education teacher and as a district support specialist. He now focuses on how media and communications can promote inclusive education for all learners. Tim, thank you so much for joining us on creating neurodiversity-affirming schools.
It's my pleasure. Very happy to be here.
To start, if you could give me your definition of what neurodiversity-affirming means to you.
I think it really just means that when a school or a classroom is being designed, that it takes into consideration the learners that are there. So if those learners happen to be neurodivergent, then that's how the classroom is designed. If it's full of neurotypical students, then that's how it's designed. So it really is taking in consideration who your learners are. And what happens is educators have this idea of their perfect classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so they design the classroom how they want the classroom to be. And I think there's benefits to that way of doing things. I just think that educators need to spend a little bit more time thinking about who is actually going to be in their classroom so that those learners can benefit from the environment.
That's a hard balance, right? It's a hard balance because as a teacher or an educator, you go into a classroom with what you know about teaching, and you don't always go into it knowing a lot about the students that are in your classroom. So I think it's an interesting flip to think about how do you design for who might be in your classroom as opposed to how do you design for you feel most comfortable teaching?
Yes. And I think, too, a neurodiversity affirming school and classroom adjust throughout the school year. I definitely did not take this into consideration, especially early on in my teaching career.
Oh, I didn't either.
I imagined my classroom how I wanted it to be and didn't know my students yet. So it was a little bit easier if I had, looped with my students or I taught in a self-contained classroom. So they would be with me for 3 to 4 to 5 years in my classroom. So I got to know my students, and so I would adjust. But when I first started teaching, it was like, this is how I'm setting up my room. And then throughout the school year, I would have to adjust because I'd say, oh, well, this area of the classroom is not working, or this procedure is not working for whatever reason. So I think it's really important for educators to reflect. And so reflect on current practices and then change if you need to. And I think that's part of being neurodiversity affirming.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that's a thread that comes through when we have conversations with educators, and myself being a former classroom teacher, is this idea that we had an idea of how we wanted to go. And then I look back at my first few years of teaching and think, oof, I could have been so much different. I mean, I don't know if I could have been better at that time in my career, but I could have been a different kind of teacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you have spent a lot of time in classrooms with students with all different kinds of disabilities. So I want to be really clear in saying that your expertise is really in inclusion across the board, not just neurodiversity affirming. And I think that's important in thinking through how do you set up classrooms. And for our conversation today around ableism, which is really a tricky conversation to have, right? I really wanted to talk to you because I know that you've seen sort of all different structures of schools, all different structures of classrooms, all different kinds of students, all different kinds of families. And one of the conversations that's really hard to have is how do we as a society put expectations into place that may exclude a lot of our learners. And so it's a tough conversation, but I really wanted to talk to you about what does ableism look like in the classroom, or even like back up and say, what does ableism mean to you in an education system?
I feel underqualified to answer this question. Part of the reason is because I am neurotypical. And so I want to be really careful with my definition or how I'm describing ableism because it's something that I don't experience. I am more ableist, right, than having ableism or this idea affecting me personally. I've worked on my ableism throughout my teaching career. So I just wanted to say that. I think how, we should be learning about ableism, at least listening to disabled people and their experiences. But I will say that part of me learning about ableism is just acknowledging that there is privilege in not being disabled. Now, I may become disabled one day. It's like one of the largest, quote unquote, minority categories.
Right.
But at this point in my life, that's not how I would describe myself or experience the world. But I think it's important to realize that it's baked into how our schools are designed.
Yeah.
And how we develop our classrooms and our curriculum. It's not designed first with how it can be accessible. So I think that that's kind of the big idea about ableism is that we're not taking into consideration those that have historically been marginalized and excluded. We create spaces in schools with the assumption that disabled people probably won't be there. It's not malicious. It's just that this is how we've typically done it.
And I think that's such an important point that it's not malicious, right? I think, and I always want to make that point. I come from an interesting place because I do consider myself disabled, right? I am neurodivergent and I consider myself disabled in certain environments, right? And so not across the board. And I've dealt with ableism from like an internalized perspective, what I expect of myself based on what the neuronorms are. But I also have privilege in being able to talk about it and recognize it and know. But I think the important point that you're bringing up there too that really stick with me is the fact that it's not malicious. It's baked into a system. And the fact that what we end up doing a lot of times is retrofitting our classrooms and our curriculum to meet the needs of the students, as opposed to thinking of that ahead of time. And I appreciate your candor in saying that you haven't experienced it and that there's privilege in that, but also you've worked on it, right? And so you said you've worked on your own. What does that look like? What have you done?
I think it's first and foremost listening to disabled people and how they experience the world and specifically school, and then actively working on my assumptions about learners. And there, presumed competence, I feel like a lot of people understand what that means now.
Yeah.
When I first entered into the field of education, I feel like that wasn't as common. This idea of presuming competence, basically assuming and presuming that a person can learn, can experience, the world and have access to what everyone else has. I'm talking about like specifically disabled individuals or students.
Right.
And I just feel like that's a more common sentiment. So I feel like that's a big step. Those are real basic things, but
I don't know that they are, though. Well, it's interesting. Like you say they're basic things, but I think you and I have been in education long enough that we've seen that evolution and that they may not be basic things. So I appreciate you calling them out. For people who are just starting in this field, I think it's important for them to understand the idea of presuming competence. Like you go into a meeting and somebody uses a phrase and you're like, I'm going to pretend I know what that phrase means.
Yeah.
I think it's important for us to make sure we're defining the phrase so people know what it means instead of just nodding along. So I think that's important.
And I would say for educators who are listening, or really anyone that's listening, to not be too hard on yourself. I think I have spent too much time in regret, just feeling inadequate because I hadn't moved along fast enough. I mean, I think there's a space for feeling that. I wouldn't let it take over, because you should use that energy to like move on, learn, and grow.
And I think that there are various different ways, right? The presuming confidence is definitely important, is expecting that our students are going to show up and be capable. And also, to some degree, I see it in the expectations that teachers have on themselves too, to some degree, right? So I see, there are a lot of teachers out there who are also neurodivergent and have the same challenges that some of our neurodivergent learners do. And I see a lot of teachers who have expectations on themselves that are based on sort of the ableist society kind of things, like, I can't get organized, I'm trying to, but it's kind of working for them. They're really good on the fly thinkers, and they do a really good job. So I think maybe I would say to teachers out there who feel like this applies to you, don't be too hard on yourself either. And then I think there's like how do we start having these conversations in classrooms so students know how to treat each other in ways that are respectful and in ways that don't shame students into thinking they're doing it wrong.
Yes. And I think that is modeled by the teacher. The teacher sets the tone for the classroom and for belonging. And there's, in teaching educators, like how to be a teacher in classrooms, right, a lot of times we talk about relationships, building relationships with your students, and that's great. Another part of that is this idea of like co-regulation. And I'm not an expert, but very basically, I think some of the best teachers who have, you want to think about classroom management. I don't love that term, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not about like coercion. It's not about expecting compliance. It's about setting up an environment for learning. But I think some of the best teachers create an environment for learning when they are open and model regulation for their students. So I remember being in elementary school, and when I heard my teacher say, you know what, I am not having a great day right now.
Yeah.
I spilled my coffee. My dog tore up, a pillow, or I got a flat tire, or whatever. And
right.
the teacher came in and was very honest and transparent and was like, you know what, I'm not having a great day. You know what? We're going to spend 5 minutes listening to like some music to calm down because I need it.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling safe. I remember feeling like, oh, this is a real person.
And it normalizes that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, when you have an educator who is just real and authentic, that I think is a real practical example of co-regulation. It's like, I am a certain way, instead of being like, I'm in the yellow zone, which is fine, I guess, like,
yeah.
It's just like being real and authentic, I think, is a really another layer of this neurodiversity affirming classroom.
I think so. And I will share with you, I work with students one-on-one, and I had a moment yesterday. I was working with an 8-year-old who, great kid, twice exceptional, ADHDer, right? And I was scattered. My brain was scattered. And I was just, poor kid, I'm trying to teach him organizational routine kind of things, but I was all over the place, and I was like, "Ooh, you got new glasses. Ooh, look at this." And I had to take a moment and say, "You know what? My brain is jumping from topic to topic today, and that's okay." Right? And to be able to say that's okay, I think I've come a long way in being able to say, like, this is just how I am. This is how some people are. And to be able to say that out loud, I mean, the relief I saw in his face surprised me, and I've been doing this a long time. I think he may be used to those expectations, those sort of ableist expectations that you have to be able to sit still, you have to be stay on the topic of conversation. And to your point, me being able to say out loud, whoa, this is not working for me today, it took some pressure off the kid, but I didn't even think that I was doing it. Like, I didn't even think about it as I was doing it.
Mm-hmm. As I was listening to you, like, you're a very authentic person. So like, you may have been a conscious decision, but that's just who you are. So I think that was, lend itself to that.
I actually appreciate you being authentic in this conversation and saying, like, here are things that I see, here are things that, could be done better. I mean, I think to some degree, the one thing that we haven't touched on is language, right? And I think that that's a place where teachers can start, in my mind, around changing an ableist perspective is like, how do we talk about students and challenges and disabilities? And
So I've been on a journey with language.
yeah,
When I first started with, in the field, especially around learners on the autism spectrum, I was taught that it was learners with autism,
right.
like that person first language. And so I became hyper focused on making sure I said the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I learned, oh, some people don't like that. In fact, I would say the majority of people who are autistic would say, I am autistic. I'm an autistic person.
Right.
And so then I think it can swing the other way where it's like now you're correcting language, which I just don't think is as, I don't think it's as beneficial as maybe we all think it is.
Yeah.
As far as language, and we can move on from autism, but like any sort of language around disability, I think it's just important to listen and to figure out either the person you're with or the audience that you're speaking to, kind of like what they feel is respectful language. Because I think a downside to focusing on language within this concept of ableism is that it ends up being like, that's the right way to say it, that's the wrong way to say it, when it's really just about like respecting humans.
I love that. I think that's such a beautiful perspective. And I think you did a really great job of earlier when you talked about classroom management. We don't have other language for that yet.
Yeah.
There isn't necessarily different language. And so respecting the fact that sometimes your language doesn't match what you want to say, but just saying that out loud too. But I really appreciate that perspective of saying, do the best you can.
Yeah. And I can I say one more thing about that?
Of course. Yeah.
So I have a podcast, Think Inclusive. I have a lot of guests.
Yeah.
And a lot of guests in the context of disability inclusion will say special needs. A lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a decision that I was not going to correct anyone's language when I was having a conversation with them, because I just don't think in that context it's beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do like intros and I do reflections and stuff like that. Will I use that language? No, absolutely not. Will I talk about that we should not use special needs as an adjective to describe disability? Absolutely. I will talk about that. But I think that in general, correcting someone's language in the moment, I just don't see the benefit unless it's like we're talking about like the R word or something like really, really egregious. But I don't know. That's kind of like a personal decision. So I'm not necessarily advocating that everyone should do that. I'm just saying this is kind of where I've landed.
I think it's valuable. And I think what you're describing is if you correct somebody in the moment, you're shutting down the opportunity to have an authentic conversation, right? You can't build a sense of belonging and connection by telling people in the moment, like, this is not how we do this, right? What you have to do is sort of hear their perspective. You can share your own perspective, and then people learn from there, right? So, I mean, I would agree with that decision.
Yeah. I like the way that you frame that.
And so I guess I'm going to ask you if there's one thing about this topic that you would want educators to walk away knowing that they could maybe put into practice today, what would it be?
I love the word reflection. That is a huge part of my message to educators is the practice of reflection. So when it comes to ableism, on any of the kind of the subpoints we're talking about with ableism, I would encourage everyone to reflect on their own practice and be like, is there any part of my practice that's ableist? And then if something comes up, is it the way I'm designing my classroom? Is it the way that, I'm interacting or my expectations with my students? Is it the language that I use? Is it the way that I'm designing my curriculum that leaves certain students out because, well, of course they wouldn't get it, type of thing? If there's anything that's part of your practice that could be ableist, work on that. How can I create a more neurodiversity affirming space for my learners? And then how you do that is you read your book, you read Amanda and Emily's book, right?
You listen to Tim's podcast, Think Inclusive.
You can listen to Think Inclusive. There's a lot of different resources out there. But you just work on one thing at a time, and don't get overwhelmed, and don't beat yourself up too much over it.
I think that's great advice. And thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it, Tim.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, Amanda, let's circle back on some of the ideas that you talked about with Tim. Maybe one of the first things that stands out to me is about the fact that when we're doing this, we really just have to question the status quo. Look at our assumptions, look at the reasons we're reacting in a certain way, and just question, what is the assumption that we're making about what somebody should be able to do or can do? And also asking, why are we thinking that things have to be done in a certain way? Because a lot of times that is just based in ableist beliefs.
One of the things that I think Tim said that was so important was he came at it from such a perspective of humility and said, I'm not disabled, so I can't describe ableism from my own personal experience, but I can describe it from what I have seen. And when he talked about listening to the experiences of disabled people, listening to your neurodivergent students, and adjusting the language you use based on what they are saying to you, I was just so struck by that attitude, right? That attitude of combating ableism by listening, by knowing when you're not the expert in the room and knowing who you should be listening to start learning more. That was really striking to me.
Yeah. And I think the last thing maybe is just recognizing that ableism isn't just coming from outside of our students. A lot of times they have that internalized ableism. And that might look like a student who doesn't think that they should access the accommodations that are offered because it's not fair to the other students, or it just gets in the way of them making attempts at things because they think that something should be easy or that they should be able to do it. And knowing that even from a very young age, our kids are getting these messages. And there are so many factors that influence this. I mean, there might be implications from their cultural background that either accepts or doesn't accept neurodivergence in different ways. There can just be expectations from parents, perhaps, who were neurodivergent and unsupported when they were growing up, and the internalized ableism that those parents have. There's so many pieces that can feed into this. And the more that we're aware of that, it just helps us understand where those students are coming from and then find the ways that work for each individual student to help them.
Lastly, I would say I appreciate everybody being willing to listen to and have these conversations. Circling back to the very first thing we said, this is not an easy topic. It is hard to talk about. It is hard to think about. And I am appreciative of all of our listeners and all of the educators and all of the parents and all of the everybody's who are out there willing to have the conversations, willing to challenge their own assumptions, and willing to start thinking about how our biases as a society impact the students and children that we are working with. And so thank you, everybody, for having this conversation with us today and joining us on this podcast.
I'm Emily Kircher-Morris.
And I'm Amanda Morin, and we'll see you next time.